The storm came without warning. In the heart of early summer, Miami was supposed to be a symphony of humidity and salt air. Sticky, restless, alive with neon lights reflected on the bay. The evenings usually smelled of coconut suntan lotion, clinging to tourists' skin. Sea breeze tangled with exhaust fumes from Lamborghinis that prowled Collins Avenue, and hibiscus petals wilting under the heat. But that night, the skies split open without mercy. Rain descended in heavy but hushed sheets, as though the city had stopped to listen. Lightning threaded across the Atlantic horizon, silver spears piercing the velvet night. And from the 40th floor of a penthouse overlooking Biscayne Bay, the skyline blurred into trembling streaks of gold turquoise and white. The glass facade wept under the storm, each rivulet carving illusions of ghosts and fire across the window pane. Alida Campbell stood barefoot at that glass wall. Her reflection hovered faintly translucent, a specter staring back at her. The penthouse around her gleamed in polished perfection, Italian marble that gleamed like moonlight chrome beams, sculpted with precision chandeliers, dripping crystal like frozen rain. Designed to impress, to intimidate, to proclaim power, yet it echoed with emptiness. Vast, silent, sterile. A museum of success, where her laughter had long ago been archived into silence. The only sound was the rain, and then the vibration. Her phone pulsed once upon the kitchen counter, a shiver in the dark. No ringtone, no hesitation. Just a message arriving with the inevitability of fate. She picked it up, and the screen illuminated her face in the dim room. 7 words stared back at her, sharp, unrelenting, cruel, in their simplicity. Mateo Anderson. I'm engaged to Isabella. Let's get a divorce. 7 words. Cold, precise, surgical. Her chest tightened. It was not the shock that hollowed her, but the confirmation, because she had known. A woman always knows. You do not lie beside a man for 3 years and fail to feel the absence of his heartbeat against your own. She had smelled the perfume not her own, an expensive European fragrance clinging to his tailored jackets. She had learned to dine alone at a marble table built for 2, staring at empty chairs and colder plates. She had heard the laughter muffled through closed doors and overseas calls, a laughter that never belonged to her. And yet when the words finally arrived, they still cut. Her lips did not tremble. Her hands did not shake. She was too practiced at silence, too disciplined at wearing composure as armor. But deep inside, beneath the elegance of her stillness, it felt as though 1,000 invisible shards pressed against her ribs. Slowly, deliberately, she set the phone down. Her body moved with the precision of someone performing a rehearsed play, an inevitable act she had memorized long before the curtain rose. She crossed the penthouse, her bare feet silent on the marble, until she reached the mahogany desk in the far corner. She opened the second drawer. Inside lay a folder. Within that folder, a single sheet of paper bearing her name. His name, and the empty lines where their signatures would sever vows once made under cathedral arches. The divorce papers. Prepared weeks ago, perhaps months. She had filled each line in solitude, in the small hours of the night, when he returned home too late, or not at all. Each letter had been a prayer and a wound. With the storm drumming against the glass, she uncapped the fountain pen. Her handwriting unfurled across the page, steady, graceful, without hesitation. No smudges, no trembling, no tears. When it was done, she placed the paper carefully in the center of the dining table. Then, with fingers that trembled only once, she slid the diamond ring from her finger. The ring glittered defiantly under the pendant lights, a fire shard against the dark marble. She stared at it, this tiny circle that had once been a promise whispered beneath fireworks on South Beach, a promise that forever could be held in a piece of platinum. Now it lay abandoned, fragile as the glass around her. Her suitcase was already packed. Only one. Small, discreet, unburdened. Clothes enough to last until she could begin again. Passport. A leather-bound notebook filled with scribbles, dreams and equations, and words she once whispered to herself before sleep stole them. And a photograph herself at 20, smiling into the sun with a confidence she had lost somewhere along the path of compromise. She walked the penthouse one last time. The living room where Mateo once uncorked champagne to celebrate his first billion-dollar acquisition. The kitchen where she had baked him a birthday cake. Her hands clumsy with flour, only to wait alone at midnight when he never came home. The bedroom vast and cold, where she had learned to curl on one edge of the bed, as if afraid to trespass across invisible borders. Every object whispered memories, but she did not reach for any of them. At the doorway she paused. The storm outside softened into drizzle raindrops, tapping gently like fingertips upon glass. She inhaled, straightened her shoulders, turned the handle, and stepped out without a backward glance. By the time Mateo returned hours later, his penthouse was silent. He entered with the swagger of a man who believed gravity itself bent to his stride. His tuxedo jacket hung loose over his arm, his tie undone, champagne clinging to his breath. Isabella had been radiant that evening, draped on his arm beneath chandeliers, her engagement ring catching every camera flash. The daughter of a dynasty, the heiress of power, the perfect strategic alliance. Love packaged in glitter. He had been toasted, envied, congratulated. He was the headline. And now, as the elevator opened into his sanctuary, he expected quiet comfort. The faint fragrance of jasmine tea Alida always brewed late at night. The sound of her footsteps, the warmth of her voice. Instead, emptiness. He dropped his keys carelessly onto the counter. His gaze swept the room. Then it landed on the table. The paper. Her name beside his signed with elegance. And beside it, the ring he had once placed on her finger beneath the vaulted ceiling of St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York. For the briefest instant, something inside him stuttered. A flicker of ache uninvited. But pride rose faster. He poured himself scotch, the amber liquid burning his throat, and muttered into the silence. She was never meant for this world. Alida was ordinary. Sweet, but ordinary. Isabella understands ambition. Isabella belongs here. He told himself that, again and again. But when he lay in bed that night, the sheets cold beside him, sleep refused him. The storm outside whispered, dragging him back to the nights Alida curled against him, to the sound of her laughter, to the dreams. She whispered half-asleep dreams he had silenced. And now, she was gone. Across the city, Alida hailed a cab in the rain. The driver asked where to miss. She gave him an address she had memorized days ago, a modest apartment in Atlanta she had rented under another name. As the taxi pulled away, she leaned her forehead against the window. The city lights smeared into golden rivers. Her eyes fluttered shut. Inside her chest, grief and relief waged quiet war. She was not leaving because she no longer loved him. She was leaving because she finally loved herself enough to stop bleeding for a man who refused to see her worth. The rain fell until dawn. The apartment smelled of new paint and dust. It was the scent of beginnings, not glamorous, not easy, but raw, like earth after a storm. Alida Campbell stood in the center of the one-bedroom flat in Atlanta, the sound of the city seeping through the thin walls. Somewhere, a baby cried. Down the street, a siren wailed and faded. The hum of life was constant, messy, and alive, so unlike the sterile silence of the Miami penthouse she had just left behind. The apartment had 4 pale walls, a narrow window, and a mattress delivered that afternoon. No polished marble, no designer furniture, no floor-to-ceiling view of the ocean. Only cracked linoleum tiles in the kitchen, a heater that groaned as if burdened by memory, and curtains unevenly hung by the previous tenant. Yet as she dropped her single suitcase onto the floor, Alida exhaled. The air she breathed belonged to her for the first time in years. She unpacked slowly, clothes folded with quiet care, a leather notebook placed on the nightstand. The photograph, her at 20, radiant in sunlight, rested against the wall beside her bed. Her hands lingered on that photo, tracing the edges of the smile she barely recognized. That girl had believed in forever, that love could hold the weight of ambition, that devotion could soften pride. That girl had died quietly in Miami. But here, perhaps, she could be reborn. She ran her hand across the mattress. It was thin, barely padded the springs complaining under the lightest pressure. Still, she felt more grounded when she sat on it than in years. Luxury had been a cage. This austerity, strange as it was, tasted like freedom. Outside rain still clung to the streets. Atlanta was warm, restless, its pulse different from Miami's gloss and sheen. Miami had always felt like Mateo's city, his playground, his empire of champagne and steel. Atlanta was neutral, unclaimed, where no one knew her name. That anonymity was a gift. On her first morning there, sunlight leaked through the cheap curtains, a pale gold rather than Miami's brilliant blaze. She woke to no sound but her own breath, no footsteps echoing through distant corridors, no voice on the phone murmuring deals worth millions. She boiled water in a dented kettle she found in the cupboard, made tea from a packet bought at the corner store. The taste was bitter, metallic almost, but it was hers. Each sip reminded her of the freedom to choose, even if the choice was simple, imperfect, even ugly. Alida sat by the window, with her tea, staring at the city street. People hurried past, clutching briefcases or grocery bags. Cars honked, bicycles weaved between traffic. Everyone here carried their own lives with urgency, but no one looked up to see her. And for once, she preferred it that way. The absence of recognition was a relief. By the third day, loneliness crept in. It wasn't the kind of loneliness that Miami had given her, the kind born of being unseen amid abundance. This was a quieter solitude, a space she had chosen, but still heavy in the hours after midnight. She would lie awake listening to the heater's uneven hiss, her body curled on the mattress, memory pressed against her. Mateo's laughter, Mateo's cologne, the ghost of his shadow across the penthouse windows. The words from his message replayed in her mind like a broken record. I'm engaged to Isabella. Let's get a divorce. She whispered into the dark, as if speaking to herself. Not because I stopped loving you, because I started loving me. Her voice trembled, but in the trembling, there was truth. Alida began to build a routine. In the mornings, she walked to a modest cafe at the corner, ordering black coffee and sitting with her notebook open. She wrote furiously, not letters, not diaries, but fragments, ideas, sketches of business plans, numbers, possibilities, thoughts she once swallowed because Mateo had dismissed them with a careless wave of his hand. Now, no one silenced her. Every page became a reclamation of her own voice. The barista began recognizing her, sliding her cup across the counter without asking, a small gesture that anchored her to the rhythm of an ordinary life. At noon, she searched job postings. Not glamorous positions, nothing close to the circles she had once moved in, but work that could sustain her until she found her path again. She applied to roles she was overqualified for translation assistant, administrative support, part-time teaching. Her resume carried the shadow of wealth that employers glanced at suspiciously. But she persisted. At night, she read finance textbooks she hadn't opened in years, market reports downloaded from free databases, articles scribbled with highlighter. Each page she consumed was a step toward the woman she wanted to be, the woman who had once dreamed of standing alone, long before Mateo's world consumed her. There were moments of weakness. Once passing by a boutique window, she froze. The mannequins wore gowns like the ones she had once chosen for Gala's gowns she had slipped into, while Mateo adjusted his cufflinks impatiently beside her. For a breath, she missed the silk against her skin, the camera flashes, and the world seemed to pause when they entered a room. But then she remembered the hollowness of those nights, the way his eyes never lingered on her, the way she became an accessory to his ambition. The gowns, the diamonds, the limousines had been smoke and mirrors disguising an absence so deep it nearly consumed her. She walked past the boutique without slowing again. The city began to teach her resilience. Atlanta was not gentle. The bus rides were crowded, the apartments noisy, the jobs scarce. But the people moved with a determination she admired. Strangers carried burdens, openly sweating in the sun, laughing in the shade, fighting and forgiving. No one cared who she had been, and that anonymity forced her to rebuild, not as Mateo's wife, not as a trophy, not as a shadow, but as Alida Campbell. One evening, sitting on the stoop outside her building, she scribbled into her notebook, "Freedom is not glamorous. It is not polished marble. Freedom is chipped paint, bitter tea, and knowing that each breath belongs to me." Her hand steadied as she wrote. Weeks passed. The loneliness shifted from a wound into a companion. It no longer suffocated her. It reminded her she was alive. She learned to walk the city streets without fear of being recognized, shop at the market where vendors shouted prices without caring who she was, and ride the bus among tired workers and school children. There was a strange beauty in the ordinariness. Alida discovered that beginnings are not grand. They are quiet. They are the sound of keys turning in a cheap lock, the taste of reheated leftovers, the feeling of counting dollars before paying rent. They are humbling, yes, but they are hers. And in that humility, she felt stronger than she ever had in Mateo's empire. One night, thunder rolled across the city again. Not as violent as the Miami storm, but heavy enough to rattle the thin windows. Alida lay awake watching the shadows flicker across the ceiling. She remembered that first night, the message, the pen, the ring left on marble. She remembered walking into the rain with nothing but her suitcase. And she realized that was the night she had been reborn. Tears came then, silent and unashamed. Not tears of longing, not of regret, but of release. Each drop carried away the residue of chains she had worn too long. She whispered into the storm, her voice steady. This time, I am no longer invisible. The thunder answered like applause. By the end of the first month, Alida had secured a position as a part-time translator for a small logistics company downtown. The pay was modest, but covered her rent and left enough for groceries. Each morning she dressed carefully, not in designer gowns, but in clean shirts pressed by her hands. She carried herself with the grace she had always possessed, but now that grace belonged to no one's gaze but her own. Her colleagues didn't know her story. They didn't know she had once sat at billionaires' tables or danced beneath chandeliers. To them, she was simply Alida, the quiet but efficient woman who precisely bridged languages. And that anonymity felt like truth. On a Sunday morning, she walked to a small park. The air was thick with magnolia blossoms. Children's laughter scattered across the grass. She sat on a bench, her notebook on her lap, and for the first time in years, she smiled not out of duty, not out of performance, but simply because the world felt wide again. She thought of Mateo, not with bitterness, not even with longing, but with clarity. He had chosen ambition wrapped in glitter. She had chosen herself. And though the path ahead was uncertain, though it would demand every ounce of strength she possessed, she knew this truth. Freedom, however fragile, was worth everything. The wind gently lifted her curls, carrying magnolia's scent through the air. Alida closed her eyes, breathed deeply, and whispered to herself, "This is only the beginning." The Pacific air was different. Where Miami had been perfumed with salt and excess, where Atlanta carried the heavy pulse of working-class survival, San Diego breathed with a gentler rhythm. The breeze rolled in from the ocean, cool against sun-warmed skin, carrying scents of eucalyptus and grilled fish from the piers. The horizon was wide, restless, and forgiving, where anyone could vanish and begin again. Alida Campbell stepped off the bus on a late afternoon in early spring, her single suitcase bumping against her heel. The streets here hummed with surfers in wetsuits clutching boards, families clustered outside taco stands, and students with earbuds weaving between bicycles. Unlike Miami, no one's gaze lingered too long. Unlike Atlanta, the air here felt stretched open, limitless. She rented a studio apartment in the Mission Hills district. A single window overlooked an alley where ivy crawled across rusted fire escapes. The building smelled faintly of detergent and fried onions. The floorboards creaked with every step. And yet this was the first place that felt like possibility rather than survival. Alida secured a position at a fledgling tech startup through a small agency. The company occupied a converted warehouse near downtown, where servers hummed in corners and pizza boxes stacked like architectural experiments. Her role was simple translation: contracts, investor decks, technical documents. She bridged English with Spanish, sometimes French, sometimes fragments of Portuguese. The pay was modest, far below what she once considered standard. But her colleagues, young, sleep-deprived, and half-fueled on energy drinks, treated her not as a trophy wife with a hidden past, but as a teammate. For the first time in years, she felt useful. Her words mattered, even if only in the shape of a translated paragraph. At lunch, she sat at communal tables, sipping lukewarm coffee, as programmers debated code and marketers pitched slogans. They didn't know her history. They didn't whisper about Mateo Anderson or the glittering empire she had left. To them, she was simply Alida, the woman with sharp eyes and steady hands. And that anonymity was freedom in its purest form. Alida's day was not over when the office lights dimmed and others stumbled home. She returned to her studio, set water to boil for tea, and opened textbooks that smelled of ink and possibility. Finance, economics, market analysis. The subjects she once studied in university, long before Mateo swept her into his orbit and convinced her his world was enough for them both. Now, every late-night page was an act of defiance. Every equation scribbled in the margins reclaimed a piece of the ambition she had buried. The window rattled with the coastal wind as she leaned over her desk, her curls falling loose, her pen moving tirelessly. Some nights, exhaustion blurred the words into nonsense, her cheek pressing against smudged notes until sleep claimed her. She always woke before dawn, eyes sore, but determination intact. She whispered to herself while highlighting lines in thick yellow ink, "Not for him. For me." It was on a fog-heavy evening that Alida discovered the seminar. A flyer pinned outside a cafe announced Global Investment Strategies. Lecture by Ethan Cross, hosted at a university hall near Balboa Park. She hesitated. The ticket cost more than she could spare. But her pulse quickened at the idea of sitting in a room where finance was spoken not as theory, but as strategy, as power. After a week of internal debate and selling the last gold bracelet she once wore at Miami galas, she bought a ticket. The hall was crowded, filled with students, analysts, and curious entrepreneurs. Alida slipped into the back row, notebook clutched to her chest. She wore a thrift store blazer 2 sizes too big, her laptop secondhand with scratches across its lid. Around her, conversations buzzed with confidence, but she stayed quiet, observing. When Ethan Cross took the stage, the room shifted. He was in his early 40s, tall, with a presence that was not loud, but commanding in its stillness. His voice carried clarity that cut through jargon and revealed meaning. He spoke of emerging markets in Asia, the balance between ambition and resilience, and opportunities found not in wealth, but in foresight. Alida's pen flew across the page. She wrote faster than she could think, each sentence etched as if it might vanish, if not captured. When the seminar ended, applause echoed against the high ceiling. People swarmed the stage, eager to shake Ethan's hand to impress him with polished questions. Alida lingered at the edge, heart hammering, before finally stepping forward. Her voice was soft but steady. "Mr. Cross, how does someone with no capital or network begin again?" The crowd thinned, moving past her. Ethan turned, his gaze landing on her. His eyes were piercing, not cruel, but discerning, as though he could see past her thrift store blazer into the fire she carried beneath. He paused before answering, then spoke with quiet gravity. "You begin by refusing to believe those things matter more than your mind." It was simple, but the words carved into her bones like prophecy. That night, Alida returned home, her notebook bursting with notes, her mind alight with possibility. She turned on her battered laptop, the screen flickering as it loaded emails. One new message awaited her. The subject line, "Resources for CFA Preparation." The sender, Ethan Cross. She froze. She hadn't given him her email, but in the sign-in sheet at the seminar, she had scribbled it, not expecting anyone to notice. Yet he had noticed. The message was brief. "I saw your notes, sharper than most questions I received tonight. If you're serious, here are resources for the CFA exam. EC." Alida leaned back, a smile breaking across her face for the first time in weeks. It was not the smile of a woman adored by cameras. It was the smile of a woman who felt seen for her mind. The following months tested her to the brink. Days at the startup, evenings in libraries, her hands stained with ink, weekends spent buried in mock exams, her stomach filled with cheap coffee and granola bars. She sold jewelry she once wore to galas, each piece funding exam fees. On some weekends, she rented her apartment to travelers and slept on a friend's couch to save money. Exhaustion clawed at her. She failed a practice exam once and allowed herself a night of tears. But the next morning she returned to the library with fiercer resolve. Whenever doubt threatened, she opened Ethan's email again, rereading his words. "Refuse to believe those things matter more than your mind." It became her mantra. The exam itself was brutal. A cavernous convention center filled with thousands of candidates hunched over desks. 3 sessions. Endless numbers. Her hand cramped from writing. Her pulse thundered with each clock tick. When the results arrived months later, she sat in her tiny apartment laptop, trembling. Her breath caught as the email opened. "Congratulations. You have passed." The tears came hot and unrestrained. She pressed her face into her hands, laughter breaking through sobs. Her victory was not tethered to someone else's name for the first time in years. It was hers. Entirely hers. Passing the CFA opened opportunities she had scarcely dared to imagine. One evening, as she packed her worn notebook into her bag, another email arrived. "If you're interested, I can recommend you for a position at Alida Capital, Singapore headquarters. It won't be easy, but it could be a beginning. EC." Alida stared at the screen. heart-pounding. Singapore, half a world away. A city she had only seen in photographs, where glass towers pierced the clouds and the future shimmered like heat on water. It felt terrifying. It felt impossible. But more than anything, it felt like destiny. On her last night in San Diego, Alida stood by her studio window. The alley below was dark, tangled with ivy, the city murmuring faintly beyond. She pressed her palm against the glass. In that reflection, she no longer saw the woman who had left Miami in silence, nor the one who struggled in Atlanta with bitterness and survival. She saw a woman reborn through fire and study through relentless nights through resilience no storm could wash away. Her suitcase sat packed by the door, not with gowns and diamonds, but with textbooks, neatly folded blazers, and that photograph of her 20-year-old self, still smiling, but now joined by a future she had fought to reclaim. Alida whispered into the night, "This is my beginning." And the city, restless and eternal, seemed to whisper back, "Go." The airplane descended through clouds heavy with tropical rain, and the city revealed itself like a jewel wrapped in mist. Singapore shimmered with glass and steel, its skyline both futuristic and disciplined towers, rising with mathematical elegance above gardens carved into order. To Alida Campbell, it looked less like a city and more like an overture of ambition, a stage for reinvention of identity. The humidity clung instantly to her skin as she stepped from the terminal. She breathed in a mixture of jet fuel orchids and salt from the sea. This was not Miami's ostentatious blaze, Atlanta's working pulse, or San Diego's restless horizon. This was precision, order. A place where chaos wore a polished suit and ambition walked without apology. Her suitcase rolled behind her like a loyal shadow. Inside were not gowns or diamonds, but pressed shirts, finance textbooks, her treasured notebook of dreams, and a single photograph of the girl she once was. She whispered to herself as she hailed a taxi, "Here I will become." The first weeks at Alara were merciless. She was assigned as a junior analyst on a probationary contract, an unspoken warning that her place was fragile. The hours stretched past midnight. Spreadsheets became her night sky numbers, her constellations. Mistakes were not merely corrected. They were dissected under fluorescent lights, magnified until humiliation became a lesson carved into bone. Senior colleagues dismissed her politely, with smiles that did not touch their eyes. "Thank you, Ms. Campbell. We'll handle it from here." Doors closed. Decisions were made without her. She became invisible again, but not in the way Mateo's world had made her invisible. This time, invisibility was a gauntlet, a challenge daring her to persist. Alida worked relentlessly. She absorbed every detail, every report, every subtle shift in tone during meetings. She volunteered for tasks others avoided, took on assignments far beyond her role. When her eyes burned too much to read, she washed her face with cold water and began again. The city outside never slept, and neither did she. Singapore taught her discipline in ways no textbook could. Mornings began with monsoon rain drumming against glass afternoons, with the metallic hum of MRT trains carrying her through steel tunnels. She ate noodles from hawker stalls, their spices searing her tongue, while reviewing market reports balanced on her knee. The city's pulse mirrored her own, precise, efficient, relentless. On Sundays, she wandered Chinatown where incense curled through temples and vendors called out in Cantonese. She stood before altars glowing with candles, breathing in the quiet strength of belief. She was not religious, but prayed in her own way for clarity, resilience, and the ability to carve a place in this world of sharpened edges. She returned to her apartment each evening, a small flat overlooking shop houses painted in faded hues. It was not luxury, but it was sanctuary. There she poured herself tea, opened her notebook, and recorded not numbers, but affirmations. I will not shrink. Resilience is as valuable as ambition. This city does not own me. I will own my place in it. It happened during a quarterly review. A senior associate presented a report on regional investments in Jakarta, his voice smooth, his slides polished. Yet Alida noticed flaws, subtle miscalculations, projections leaning on shaky assumptions. She sat in silence at first, her pen tapping softly. Then, as the room prepared to nod and move on, she raised her voice. Excuse me, if I may, there's an inconsistency in the projected cash flow. The risk analysis doesn't account for recent policy changes in Indonesia. If those reforms hold, the forecast is overly conservative. The room stilled. The associate frowned, already preparing a dismissal. But Alida continued, her voice calm yet firm, citing specific clauses, figures she had memorized from reports no one else had read in detail. A senior partner leaned forward. Do you have supporting data? Ms. Campbell? She slid a printout across the table. Her own analysis written in midnight ink pages, annotated with care. Silence followed. Then the partner nodded slowly. Impressive. Let's revise based on this. For the first time, the room looked at her not as decoration, but as mind. Recognition did not soften the environment. If anything, it sharpened it. Some colleagues grew hostile, their smiles edged with envy. Others avoided her, uncomfortable with a woman who disrupted their complacency. She became both admired and isolated, a paradox she learned to endure. At night, she returned home drained but defiant. She cooked simple meals, rice, vegetables, sometimes only tea, and reminded herself that hunger could be fuel. She studied late, expanding her knowledge beyond assignments, preparing herself for doors not yet opened. Ethan's emails still arrived occasionally. Encouragement, articles he thought she would appreciate, a quiet reminder that someone believed in her even an ocean away. She never relied on him but treasured the proof that she was seen. She was sent to Kuala Lumpur 2 years into her journey on her first solo assignment. The city greeted her with tropical storms and skyscrapers rising above tangled streets. She navigated negotiations with precision, her voice steady, her logic sharp. When local partners underestimated her, she disarmed them with calm facts. By the time she returned to Singapore, the report she delivered was so thorough that even her harshest critics acknowledged it. Promotions followed, first to senior associate, then to director of regional investments. Her name began to circulate in whispers through the corridors of Alara the Iron Lady with a velvet touch. It was not said with mockery. It was said with respect. One evening, long past midnight, Alida stood at her office window. The skyline glittered, the rain trailing silver across the glass. She thought of the woman who had once placed her ring on a dining table in Miami. She thought of the nights in Atlanta, where survival felt like the only goal. She thought of San Diego, of exhaustion and triumph, of Ethan's words that had carried her here. Now she was no longer a shadow. She was flame. Yet even as triumph warmed, her loneliness lingered. She kept her personal life walled away, unwilling to let vulnerability undo her. Suitors appeared dazzled by her presence, but she politely, detachedly declined them. She did not crave love that demanded she shrink. Still, in quiet hours, she sometimes reread Ethan's old message. She wondered what it would feel like to speak with him again, not as a student, but as an equal. Her ascent was far from over. Her assistant handed her a file at a board meeting one rainy morning. The cover bore a name she had not spoken aloud in years. Anderson Global Holdings. A contract negotiation. Hundreds of millions at stake. The man across the table would be Mateo Anderson. For a moment the room tilted. Memories surged his voice. His betrayal, the storm in Miami, the ring left behind, the silence that followed. Alida inhaled deeply. Her reflection in the glass was steady, unyielding. She closed the file and spoke calmly. Prepare the agenda. This will be business as usual. But inside, a storm had already begun. The morning air in Washington carried the thickness of summer, a weight that pressed down as though even the sky held its breath. The city gleamed in stone and glass monuments, rising like testaments to ambition avenues cutting through the capital with military precision. Power lived here, visible in the polished shoes, striding across marble steps, the tinted windows of black cars sliding past, and the whispered conversations that decided fates across continents. A boardroom awaited in the heart of this city, on a high floor of a gleaming tower. Mahogany table, leather chairs, screens glowing with charts and projections. The stage for a battle dressed as negotiation. Alida Campbell arrived with her team from Alida Capital. Her white suit was tailored with exacting simplicity, no adornment save a watch clasped at her wrist. Her hair was drawn into a smooth knot at the nape of her neck. She carried no jewelry, no symbols of indulgence, only documents, precision, and the unshakable composure of a woman who had fought her way through storms. When she entered the room, adjusted itself. Conversation stilled. Eyes followed. She did not command attention by demand. She commanded it by existence. Mateo Anderson entered moments later, the confident stride of a man long accustomed to victory. His suit was flawless, his cufflinks gleaming his smile, the carefully practiced curve that had charmed boardrooms and seduced headlines. Yet behind his steel-gray eyes lingered a weariness he never admitted. He expected the room to bow inward, as it always did. Instead, he felt it tilt, because across the table sat the woman he had once dismissed as ordinary, the woman who had left his penthouse in silence, her ring abandoned under the light, the woman who now returned not as memory, but as power. Alida. The name struck him in silence before his lips even moved. She did not falter when their eyes met. For the briefest flicker, something passed, a recognition of history of wounds never spoken. Then her gaze moved past him, steady and professional, as though he were no more significant than the chandelier overhead. Director Campbell, someone introduced. Mr. Anderson. The formalities felt foreign on his tongue. The meeting began with numbers. Slides lit the screen's charts of projections, graphs of potential returns. The Alida delegation spoke with crisp authority, their voices practiced. Alida guided them like a conductor, her interjections precise, her notes written with a hand that did not waver. Mateo tried to focus on the data, but his attention betrayed him. Every time she leaned forward to make a point, every time her pen moved across the page, memory stabbed him. Her laughter in their kitchen, the softness of her hand on his wrist, the silence she left behind. For 3 years he had buried those echoes beneath work, beneath Isabella's glittering presence, beneath ambition that devoured even sleep. Yet here she was, and every wall he had built crumbled in silence. When a shareholder raised concerns about risk in Asian markets, Mateo expected her to defer, but Alida answered directly, her voice clear, eloquent. Alida believes risk is not in the market, but in leadership that refuses to adapt. We invest in resilience as much as ambition. Her eyes flickered to him for an instant, enough for him to understand the double meaning. The room murmured approval. Mateo clenched his jaw. By noon, the meeting recessed. Executives filtered out for calls and coffee. The room emptied until only 2 figures remained. Alida closed her laptop with measured calm. She gathered her papers, preparing to leave. Alida. Her name slipped from his lips before he could restrain it. She paused, back straight. Slowly she turned. Her expression was unreadable, carved from years of discipline. "Yes, Mr. Anderson," she replied, her voice formal. The sound of her surname, Anderson, spoken, as if it were foreign to her, sliced deeper than anger. "It's been a long time," he murmured. Her eyes did not soften. 3 years and 11 days, she said evenly. "But I didn't expect you to be counting." The precision cut through him. She had counted not with nostalgia, but as one tally's survival. He searched her face, desperate for a fragment of the softness that once belonged to him. "You look different." She inclined her head. "Yes, I am." And with that, she turned away, heels striking the marble floor with finality. The second half of the meeting was even more brutal. Terms, clauses, contingencies, all dissected with surgical precision. Alida never faltered. When disputes arose, she dismantled them with logic. When compromises were offered, she measured them against Alara's standards, not Anderson's desperation. Mateo felt the shift of power like gravity reversing. Once she had waited for him at tables of silence. Now he was waiting for her words to decide the room's direction. His CFO leaned in at one point, whispering, "She's formidable." Mateo's gaze did not leave her. "Yes," he whispered back almost to himself. "She always was." By evening, the session ended without resolution. Alara did not withdraw, but neither did they commit. The terms hung in the air like a storm not yet broken. Executives rose, shook hands, dispersed into the city's pulse. Mateo lingered, his hand tightening around the back of a chair, watching Alida gather her documents. She moved with composure, each motion precise, unhurried. He remembered how those same hands once baked him a birthday cake he never came home to taste. She glanced at him once more, not as a lover or enemy, but as a professional untouchable. "Thank you, Mr. Anderson," she said politely. And she walked out. The echo of her heels lingered long after she was gone. Across the city, Alida sat in her hotel room, papers spread across the desk. Her team had gone to dinner, but she stayed behind sipping tea in quiet solitude. The rain tapped gently against the window. She thought of the boardroom, the weight in Mateo's gaze, and the way his voice faltered when he spoke her name. She thought of the man he had been, of the choices that had driven her to leave. There was no longing in her chest, no anger, only clarity. She whispered into the quiet, "You chose your empire. I chose myself." And she felt no shadow pressing against her for the first time in years. The next morning, Washington woke gray under clouds. Alara's directive arrived. They would withdraw if terms did not improve. Alida relayed it calmly, her voice steady though inside a storm churned. Because this was more than business. This was history, rewritten, dignity reclaimed. Mateo Anderson had once reduced her to silence. Now she carried the pen that could decide the fate of his empire. She stood at the window of her suite, gazing over the city where monuments proclaimed legacy. She touched the cool glass, her reflection sharp and unyielding. This time she whispered, "I am no one's shadow." The rain began to fall again, streaking down the glass like silver veins. And somewhere across the city, Mateo Anderson lay awake in his suite, haunted by the truth that the woman he once dismissed was now the axis of his fate. London wore its autumn coat with understated elegance. The Thames curled through the city like a ribbon of liquid silver, and fog pressed low over the streets, wrapping cathedrals and glass towers alike in a veil of secrecy. The air smelled of damp stone and roasted chestnuts from vendors along Westminster Bridge. For Alida Campbell, the city felt like a whisper, neither as ostentatious as Miami, nor as ordered as Singapore, but something older, heavier, carrying centuries of ambition layered like bricks. She arrived for the Global Investment Forum, one of the most prestigious conferences in the financial world. Delegations from every continent gathered here, Ministers in crisp suits, CEOs with entourages, consultants whose words could tilt markets. London in those days was less a city than a stage, and every player sought their spotlight. Alida did not seek the spotlight, yet inevitably it found her. On the morning of her keynote address, she stood behind the velvet curtains of a grand hall, the chandeliers above glittering with cold brilliance. Her notes rested in her hand, though she barely glanced at them. Years ago she might have trembled in such a space, wondering if her presence was enough. Now she inhaled deeply and allowed silence to steady her pulse. When her name was announced, the hall quieted. Cameras flashed as she stepped onto the stage. She looked neither fragile nor flamboyant, dressed in a slate-gray suit that carried elegance without ostentation. She looked inevitable. Her speech was not fiery nor theatrical. It was deliberate, eloquent, each word carrying the weight of conviction. She spoke of resilience, the balance between growth and ethics, and investments that must not only profit, but endure. Her cadence was smooth, her gaze unwavering, her voice threaded with quiet authority. By the time she concluded, applause swelled like a tide, not thunderous, not wild, but reverent. The kind of applause that acknowledged not just performance, but presence. And among the audience, two men watched her with vastly different eyes. At the far end of the hall, behind rows of dignitaries and financiers, Mateo Anderson leaned back in his seat. He had officially come as the head of Anderson Global to network and negotiate. Unofficially, he had come for this to see her. Her name had haunted him since Washington, lingering in boardrooms, sleepless nights, and every mirror he passed. But photographs in newspapers were pale shadows. He wanted to see her alive, commanding, radiant. And now, as she spoke beneath crystal chandeliers, he felt the truth crush him. She was extraordinary. Not the accessory he once tried to mold, but the centerpiece of her own stage. His chest constricted. Applause roared in his ears, but to him it was judgment. That evening, London's fog thickened, wrapping bridges in ghostly outlines. Alida left the gala dinner early, her heels clicking softly against cobblestones as she walked along the Thames. The city lights shimmered across the water, fractured into gold and silver veins. Still taking notes like a student, a voice teased gently. She turned. Ethan stood a few paces away, jacket slung over his arm, his tie loosened. He carried a paper cup and extended it toward her. Tea. Strong. You might need it. She accepted the warmth seeping into her fingers. Their hands brushed lightly, an innocent contact, yet a current passed between them. Thank you, she said softly. They walked side by side along the river. The fog clung to their coats, and silence stretched comfortably. Finally, Ethan asked, "Does London feel different this time?" Alida arched a brow. Different how you're not here as someone's shadow anymore. You're here as the light itself. She inhaled the words, sinking deep. For years, she had resisted the idea of being defined by someone else's gaze. But Ethan's was not possessive. It was recognition, respect. And in that recognition, she felt seen. Mateo watching. Unbeknownst to her, Mateo had left the gala as well. Drawn by something he could not name, he found himself on the same riverwalk, his steps echoing softly. And there in the mist, he saw them, Alida and Ethan, walking close, their silhouettes brushing against the glow of street lamps. He stopped in the shadows, unable to move forward. Jealousy burned like acid in his veins. But it was more than jealousy. It was the realization that another man had what he had squandered, not her beauty, presence, or trust. When Ethan handed her the cup of tea, when she accepted with a faint smile, it felt like a knife. He turned away before they saw him, his heart heavy with a weight he had no language for. The dinner at the bistro. Later that night, Ethan led Alida into a small French bistro on a quiet street. The windows fogged with steam candles flickered on wooden tables, and the air smelled of butter and wine. They sat across each other, their conversation flowing easily from work to travel, from the chaos of airports to the quiet of books. There was no performance between them, no pretense, just two people sharing a meal, letting pauses linger without discomfort. When dessert arrived, an apple tart split between them. Ethan leaned forward, his voice low. "I've watched you build yourself from the ground up, brick by brick, night by night. I never doubted you'd get here. But I've wondered when you'd let someone stand beside you again." Alida's fork paused midway. Her heart quickened. She lifted her gaze, startled by the sincerity in his eyes. "Ethan," she began, but he raised a hand gently. "I don't need an answer," he said softly. "I only need you to know I'll always be one step behind, if that's what you want, or one step beside, if you'll allow it." The candlelight trembled between them, and something inside her, something long buried, stirred. The weight of memory. Back in his hotel, Mateo stared at the ceiling, the echoes of the night refusing him rest. He had spent years convincing himself that ambition was worth every sacrifice. Alida's departure had been inevitable, and Isabella was the right choice. But seeing her now radiant in her own right, and seeing her beside Ethan, steady, unassuming, respectful, he felt the hollowness of his choices. For the first time, he wondered if power meant nothing, when it could not summon back the only thing he truly wanted. In her hotel room, Alida placed Ethan's paper cup on the nightstand, as if it were a relic. She stood by the window, fog pressing against the glass, the river glowing faintly below. She thought of Mateo's eyes that afternoon, how they had flickered when they met hers. She thought of Ethan's words by the river, the offer not of possession, but of presence. Her heart trembled not with confusion, but with recognition. She was no longer a woman defined by another. She was a woman who could choose. And whatever choice she made, it would be hers. Entirely hers. The next day, London buzzed with rumors. Delegates gossiped about Alara's firm stance, poise, an Eton quiet figure near her side who was. Reporters speculated, cameras lingered. But Alida moved through the noise with unbroken composure. When she spoke on panels, she spoke with the weight of conviction. When she shook hands, she did so as an equal. And everywhere she went, whispers followed Alida Campbell. "She's the one to watch." From the shadows, Mateo listened. From the front row, Ethan watched. And at the center, Alida walked steadily forward, her reflection strong in every pane of glass. The river carried secrets beneath its surface. The fog wrapped the city in mystery, and destiny stretched ahead like a bridge waiting to be crossed. For Alida Campbell, the past no longer held chains. It was only context. The future was hers to claim. Tokyo shimmered like a constellation brought to Earth. Neon lights bled across the skyline. Kanji glowing against the night trains roared through steel arteries, and every intersection urgently pulsed. The city was a symphony of precision timers, signals, footsteps aligned in rhythm, ambition encoded into its heartbeat. For Alida Campbell, arriving here felt like stepping into a crucible. She had spoken in London and conquered Washington, but Tokyo was different. This was not only finance, it was theater. Every move would be studied, every gesture recorded, every word carried across oceans. The Global Innovation and Finance Summit was no mere gathering. It was the furnace where reputations turned into legacies. The ballroom of the Imperial Tower was resplendent. Crystal chandeliers hung like frozen constellations. Silk banners fluttered, and flags from major economies framed the stage. Delegates sat poised in neat rows, headphones ready for translations, notebooks open, and pens balanced like swords. Alida walked onto the stage in an ivory silk suit, cut with severe elegance. She wore no necklace, no adornment save for a slim watch. She needed no sparkle. Her presence was ornament enough. Ladies and gentlemen, she began, her voice steady, carried across earpieces into dozens of languages. We gather here, not merely to discuss capital, but vision. Her words flowed like water, calm and measured each sentence, weaving numbers into philosophy. She spoke of sustainable investment markets that thrived not by greed, but endurance. She invoked resilience, the lesson she had learned, turning personal scars into universal truths without ever revealing the details. By the time she finished, the hall erupted in applause. Not thunderous, not frantic, but reverent. The kind reserved for leaders, not speakers. And among the crowd, two pairs of eyes fixed on her with entirely different storms inside. At the back of the hall, Mateo Anderson sat motionless. He had not come for the numbers, nor the projections. He had come for her. Seeing her on that stage felt like standing at the edge of a mirror, staring at the reflection of a life he had thrown away. He remembered calling her ordinary, convincing himself she would never belong in this world. Yet here she stood, commanding a room of titans, radiant with a power that no empire of his could match. His hands tightened on his knees. For years, he had told himself ambition excused everything, her silence, absence, and departure. But in Tokyo's brilliance, he saw his excuse collapse. Because she had been extraordinary all along, and he had been blind. Ethan Cross leaned slightly forward from the front row, his gaze never leaving her. His admiration carried no possessiveness. It was quiet pride born not from wanting to own, but from having witnessed a flame grow into fire. When she spoke of resilience, his chest tightened. He remembered the young woman in San Diego, trembling, but determined, asking how to begin with nothing. Now she was here, her voice echoing across continents, and when she descended the stage, their eyes met. His nod was subtle, but it anchored her in the whirlwind. After her keynote, Alida slipped into the marble corridor. Delegates clustered, journalists whispered, cameras flashed, but she moved through them like water, untouchable. Then her name. Alida. She froze that voice. She turned slowly. Mateo stood there. His suit immaculate, his shoulders straight, but his eyes carried the fatigue of years unslept. For a moment, the crowd dissolved around them. Mr. Anderson, she greeted, her voice cool, professional. Just Mateo, he murmured, almost pleading. Her lips curved faintly, not in a smile but in acknowledgement. That was another lifetime. The corridor seemed to tighten, every sound dulled, except the echo of their history. He searched her face, desperate for softness. You've changed, he said finally. She raised an eyebrow. People do. I don't mean success. He pressed his voice low. You carry yourself differently, stronger. Her gaze sharpened, slicing clean. Perhaps because I no longer carry the weight of someone else's neglect. The words landed like a blade. He flinched, but did not respond. And before silence consumed him, a delegate approached Alida with a question, pulling her away. She left without looking back. That evening, the summit hosted a gala in the ballroom, music swelling from violins, crystal glasses chiming under chandeliers. Alida arrived in a gown of midnight silk, her figure elegant yet restrained. Ethan accompanied her not as a claim, but as a presence. He carried himself with quiet dignity, the kind of man who never needed to announce his worth. Together, they were striking. Not because of extravagance, but because of balance. Two figures walking in tandem, steps aligned without effort. Across the room, Mateo watched. His chest constricted as he remembered the last time he had held her hand At such an event, distracted by calls, his mind elsewhere, blind to her glow. Now another man looked at her, as he once should have, with admiration, untainted by pride. When Ethan extended his hand for a dance, and Alida placed hers in his, Mateo felt his world tilt. The waltz began, her gown sweeping her smile, faint but real, their eyes meeting often with warmth unspoken. Mateo stood rooted, every note of the music carving regret deeper into him. Later, Ethan led Alida into the quiet garden behind the gala hall. Lanterns glowed faintly among trees, leaves drifting onto gravel paths. The city's roar softened into a hush of crickets and distant horns. He paused, his voice gentle. "I won't pretend I don't care for you, but I also won't rush you. You've built walls for reasons I respect. All I ask is this: when you're ready, let me be the one you lower them for." Her breath caught. For years, she had met men who demanded, tried to mold, measured love and control. Ethan's words were different, an offer, not a cage. She smiled faintly, a softness rare on her face. "You make it sound easy." He shook his head. "It won't be easy, but it will be real." The lantern light seemed to bend around them for a moment, holding the moment still. Meanwhile, Mateo walked alone through Tokyo's neon streets. Billboards screamed in color above him. Laughter spilled from izakayas, but the noise blurred into emptiness. He thought of her eyes, steady as stone, meeting his without a flicker of longing. He thought of her hand resting easily in another's. For years, he had believed himself unshakable. But now, he realized he was the fragile one. His empire, his name, his legacy. None could shield him from the truth. The most significant loss of his life was not financial. It was personal. And this time, he understood there would be no reclaiming her. Back in her hotel suite, Alida stood by the window. Tokyo's skyline shimmered like a galaxy, neon bleeding into the dark. She pressed her hand lightly to the glass. Her thoughts drifted not with longing, but with clarity. She did not hate Mateo. Hatred was heavy. What she felt was something colder, cleaner, detachment. Yet somewhere deep inside, a fragment stirred. Not of betrayal, but of the younger love she had once believed eternal. She let it surface. Then she let it fade. Because tonight, she was not the woman who waited in silence. She was the woman standing in Tokyo, her future entirely in her hands. Los Angeles glittered differently from any city Alida Campbell had known. Its light was relentless, its streets humming with reinvention, its sky burning with an almost theatrical sun. Hollywood glared, nearby studios whispered dreams, and every cafe seemed staged for discovery. To Alida, however, the city felt heavy. She had come for meetings, for negotiations, for alliances. Yet before the week was done, Los Angeles would turn into a crucible that tested not her skills in finance, but her dignity, her very name. It began with a headline: Alida Campbell, under investigation. Alleged misappropriation of funds at San Diego startup. The words slashed across every screen. Phones, televisions, tablets glowing in cafes. Within hours, blogs replicated it. News anchors repeated it. Hashtags trended worldwide. Images of Alida filled the feeds. Her face serious in Tokyo, poised in London, radiant in Singapore, and now paired with words like corruption, betrayal, and greed. At first, she thought it was a mistake. But as her phone buzzed relentlessly, investors, colleagues, even distant acquaintances, demanding answers, the truth sank in. It wasn't a mistake. It was a strike. Her assistant's voice trembled as she entered the hotel suite, laptop under her arm. "They're tearing you apart online. Investors are panicking. Should we release a statement? Something." Alida closed her eyes briefly, her breath steady, though her chest tightened. She sat on the edge of the bed, scrolling through the accusations. Selective documents, falsified emails, manipulated testimonies. They painted her as ruthless, ambitious enough to siphon money from the company that had once been her lifeline. Her name had always been paired with resilience, elegance, and power. Now, in a single day, it was paired with betrayal. And in the deepest layer of her intuition, she knew this was orchestrated. Someone had waited for her moment of triumph, then struck when her light was brightest. Across the city, in another penthouse, Mateo Anderson read the duplicate headlines. Champagne glasses from the previous night's gala still cluttered his table, but his attention was consumed by the articles scrolling across his screen. He felt the blood drain from his face. Because he knew. Weeks ago, in a haze of whiskey and bitterness, he had spoken carelessly to someone, a journalist with too many questions. A woman once in Isabella's circle. He had let slip fragments of Alida's past in San Diego. He hadn't fabricated, hadn't invented. But he had given away pieces. And pieces in the wrong hands became weapons. Now those weapons had cut her. Mateo closed the laptop, pressing his palms against his eyes. He hadn't wanted this, not like this. But silence had let it grow. His silence had made him complicit. For the first time, his empire felt like a cage he couldn't control. When Ethan Cross heard the news, he did not hesitate. He boarded the first plane from Singapore to Los Angeles, but his schedule was abandoned without apology. By the time he arrived, Alida was in the middle of a meeting with her legal team. Papers were spread across the table, her composure unshaken despite the storm outside. When the lawyers left, Ethan stepped inside. He said nothing at first, only stood by the window watching her as she massaged her temples. Finally, she looked up. "You didn't have to come." "I did," he replied. "You're not fighting this alone." The steadiness in his voice pierced through her armor. She exhaled, a moment of vulnerability slipping past. His presence was not dramatic, not theatrical. It was quiet, but it was enough to remind her she was not alone. "Then stay," she murmured. For 2 days, Alida said nothing publicly. She ignored the flashing cameras outside her hotel, the reporters shouting accusations, the trending hashtags filled with venom. She let the storm rage, not because she was weak, but because silence was sometimes a strategy. Meanwhile, her legal team worked tirelessly. Each allegation was examined, and each document was traced. And slowly the truth emerged. The evidence was fabricated. Witness accounts contradicted themselves. Transactions had been altered and signatures forged. The trail led back to accounts tied to her old rivals in San Diego networks, connected however faintly to Isabella's circle. And at the very root, whispers of information Mateo had once let slip. On the third morning, Alida walked into the ballroom of a Los Angeles hotel. Cameras flashed instantly. Microphones clustered like hungry mouths. She wore a charcoal gray suit, her face calm, her presence unshaken. No jewelry, no extravagance, only authority. She stepped up to the podium, adjusted the microphone, and let silence fall before she spoke. 3 days ago, allegations surfaced, questioning my integrity. They claimed I stole, that I betrayed trust, that my ambition outweighed my ethics. She paused, her gaze sweeping across the room. Today, I will not only answer those allegations, I will dismantle them. Screens lit behind her, displaying documents verified by independent auditors. Transaction records proved not theft, but transparency. Witness statements exposing contradictions. Evidence reveals that her dismissal years ago was retaliation for whistleblowing, not corruption. What some call betrayal, she said, her voice cutting through the air like steel wrapped in velvet. I call courage. I did not steal. I exposed theft, and I would do it again. For a heartbeat silence. Then applause erupted, not from everyone but from enough. Cameras clicked like gunfire, and within hours headlines flipped. By afternoon, the internet's verdict changed course. Alida Campbell, vindicated documents, reveal whistleblowing past. From accused to hero. How Campbell turned scandal into triumph. Markets rallied. Investors reaffirmed their trust. Analysts praised her composure, her clarity, her refusal to break. She had not only survived the storm, she had risen above it untouchable. And somewhere in the city, Mateo watched the broadcast. He saw her poised at the podium, saw the fire in her eyes, and felt the weight of his own weakness. His silence had hurt her. His pride had armed her enemies. He whispered to the empty room, "I'm sorry." But the words dissolved into air. They meant nothing now. That evening, Alida stood on the balcony of her suite, the city sprawling beneath her headlights, streaming like veins of light. The storm had passed, but its echo lingered. Ethan joined her, leaning against the railing beside her. He did not speak at first. Silence between them was never empty. It was trust. Finally, she whispered, "It was him. Mateo." He gave them the pieces. Ethan's jaw tightened. "Then he doesn't deserve another moment of your pain." Her lips trembled, but she steadied herself. "He's already taken years. He won't take more." She turned her face toward the night air, and Ethan stood beside her, a silent shield against the world. In the following days, Alida's reputation did not just recover, it soared. She was no longer admired for her elegance or intellect. She was respected for her resilience, her refusal to crumble. Commentators called her a phoenix rising from ashes, meant to bury her. Others called her the velvet strategist, a woman who fought storms not with fire, but with clarity. But for Alida, the victory was not about headlines. It was about self. She had proven that no storm betrayal or whisper from her past could take away the truth of who she was. Late one night, she stood again at the balcony, Ethan's presence steady beside her. She closed her eyes, inhaled deeply, and whispered to herself, "Strength is not carrying more. It's finally setting something down." San Francisco woke beneath a veil of fog, the Golden Gate Bridge half swallowed by mist, its red spines vanishing into a sky that seemed undecided between morning and night. The city hummed with cable cars and gull cries, but to Alida Campbell, it felt like a battlefield waiting for her footsteps. Her car rolled silently through the streets toward the towering headquarters of Anderson Global. Steel and glass rose above her like a monument to the man she had once loved, the man who had wounded her, the man she would finally confront. On the seat beside her lay a leather folder. Inside, evidence. Not rumors, not whispers, but proof linking the smear campaign in Los Angeles back to its source. And that source bore one name, Mateo Anderson. She straightened her shoulders as the car slowed. Her reflection in the tinted glass was calm, composed. This was not vengeance. It was clarity. The lobby of Anderson Global gleamed with cold, polished marble floors, chrome accents, the faint scent of lilies in crystal vases. Employees glanced up as she entered, recognition flashing across their faces. Their whispers followed her, like shadows. Alida Campbell. The woman who once vanished. The woman who returned. Security escorted her to the executive floor. The elevator ascended in silence, the numbers glowing steadily upward. Each floor was another layer of history, peeling away, bringing her closer to the man who had once held her heart. When the doors opened, Mateo was waiting. He looked older not by years alone, but by burdens. His suit was immaculate, his tie knotted with precision, but his eyes betrayed fatigue. He stood tall, yet something in his stance faltered. a man who had built empires, but lost the one thing that mattered most. "Alida," he said, his voice low. "Mr. Anderson," she replied, her tone precise, slicing formality like a blade. The distance in her voice struck him harder than any insult. She was no longer his wife, the woman who had once waited at dinner tables set for two. She was a storm, clothed in calm. They entered the boardroom together. Executives were already seated, their faces taut with unease. A mahogany table stretched between them, polished so perfectly that it reflected the tension in the air. Alida placed the folder at the center, her fingers steady. "These," she said, her voice unwavering, "are records tracing the false allegations against me. The trail leads here to you." Gasps rippled across the room. Eyes darted toward Mateo. He stiffened, his jaw tightening. "I never—" "Please," she interrupted, her eyes sharp. "Please do not insult me with denial. You may not have written the lies, but gave them the pieces. Out of pride, out of bitterness." Silence crushed the room. Executives shifted uncomfortably, realizing this was no longer mere business. It was judgment. For a moment, Mateo held his composure. But cracks appeared. His hands clenched, his voice roughened. "I was angry," he admitted. "I was weak, but I never meant for it to destroy you." Her gaze did not waver. "Intent does not erase consequence. You armed them, Mateo, and they tried to bury me with what you gave." The words struck like hammer blows. He looked at her, really looked, and for the first time the weight of his actions pressed fully upon him. He rose abruptly, pushing his chair back. His voice broke past control. "I lost you once. I thought success would fill the void, but it didn't. I watched you rise higher than I ever imagined, and I hated myself for letting you go. Those words I gave away, they weren't betrayal. They were a cry I didn't know how to silence." His eyes glistened, but Alida's remained unyielding. "You mistake confession for redemption," she said softly. "But redemption is not yours to claim. Not here. Not with me." She gathered the documents, sliding them back into the folder. Rising, she addressed the executives with calm finality. "Ilara has no further interest in ties with Anderson Global. Our investments will be redirected elsewhere. This is not vengeance. It is a principle. A company built on instability cannot be trusted." Her words sealed the company's fate more decisively than any contract. The executives lowered their eyes, none daring to challenge her. Mateo closed his eyes, the weight of finality sinking into his chest. As the room emptied, Alida paused at the door. She turned, her eyes meeting his one last time. "You once told me I was ordinary," she said, her voice even. "But the truth is, I was extraordinary, and you never saw it. That was your blindness, and now it is your burden." Her voice did not tremble. It was not angry, not tender. It was a verdict. Mateo's lips parted, but no words came. He remained frozen as she walked out, her heels echoing down the corridor like the sound of closure itself. Outside, San Francisco's fog had begun to thin. Sunlight pierced through, gilding the steel and glass of the tower. Alida stepped into the light, the folder tucked under her arm. For years, she had carried shadows of their past. But as the morning brightened, she realized she no longer carried them. They belonged to him now. Inside the boardroom, Mateo sat long after everyone else had gone. The documents lay scattered before him. His empire no longer felt like a power. It felt like a mausoleum of choices that had cost him everything he once thought indestructible. He whispered her name into the silence. It echoed back hollow, the room answering with judgment, not solace. That evening, Alida stood in her hotel room overlooking the bay. The water shimmered with dusk. The bridge lit like a string of fire across the horizon. She held her phone loosely, as Ethan's voice reached her across the ocean. "How did it go?" he asked. "It ended," she said. "Do you feel lighter?" She paused, her gaze on the glowing bridge. "Not lighter, stronger. Sometimes strength isn't carrying more. It's finally setting something down." Her words were not for him. They were for herself. Meanwhile, Mateo poured a glass of whiskey that he could not drink in his office. He wandered the empty halls of his penthouse walls, echoing with silence. On a shelf sat a framed photograph he hadn't touched in years, their wedding day sunlight in her hair, her smile radiant with the belief that love could conquer anything. He traced the glass with a trembling finger. His chest ached with a weight that refused release. The city pulsed outside, but inside time stood still. For the first time, he understood the most significant investment of his life had been the one he never made. And it was gone. Singapore's night was alive with warmth. The skyline shimmered against Marina Bay towers, mirrored in water so still it seemed carved from glass. Gardens by the bay glowed with their artificial constellations, the super trees lit in violet and silver. The city pulsed, not with chaos, but rhythm, like a heart that had found its pace. It was here that Alida Campbell chose to anchor her legacy. Months had passed since San Francisco. Whispers of Anderson Global's decline still wandered through financial circles, but they no longer belonged to her world. Alida had redirected her focus to something new, a fund dedicated to women-led enterprises across Asia and Africa. The idea had come to her late at night, her hand scribbling in her notebook as the city hummed outside. Too many women, she realized, had dreams that died quietly in the shadows because no one believed in them. She had once been one of those women. Now she had the power to change it. The fund launched quietly, but reverberated loudly. Articles appeared in global journals. Campbell Foundation, redefining capital through empowerment. From survivor to strategist. Alida Campbell's next chapter. Her office became a sanctuary for stories, young entrepreneurs with trembling voices, women with hands calloused from work, but eyes fierce with vision. She listened. She invested. She gave them what she once fought to claim belief. On the morning of the fund's signing, Ethan Cross entered her office with a small silver box. He placed it on her desk without ceremony. Inside lay a sleek pen, its weight delicate yet profound. "It's yours," he said, "to sign futures." Alida lifted it, turning it in her hand. Her throat tightened. "You always know what to give." "Not what to give," Ethan corrected gently. "What to honor." Their eyes met steady and unbroken. For a moment, silence hung between them, thick with possibility. Love did not arrive as a storm this time. It came quietly like dawn, pressing light into a room. Alida and Ethan began to share more than work-late dinners after long meetings. Walks through the botanical gardens, laughter carried into humid nights. Conversations are not about markets or deals, but childhood memories, music and silence. He never rushed her, never demanded. He stood beside her, not ahead, not behind, beside. One evening they sat on her balcony overlooking the bay. She sipped wine, the city sparkling below. "Do you ever regret," she asked softly, "that you've given so much of your time to help me rise?" Ethan's smile was faint, his voice steady. "You were never my project, Alida. You were always my equal. I didn't help you rise. I walked with you while you grew yourself." Her heart was long cautious, long scarred and trembling. This was not love that demanded sacrifice. It was love that gave freedom. Across the ocean, winter fell harshly on New York. Snow piled against marble estates, and winds howled down avenues. Inside his penthouse, Mateo Anderson sat in silence. His empire was fractured. Investors whispered of replacement. Directors doubted his judgment. But the greater collapse was not financial. It was personal. He had seen her in San Francisco, the strength in her voice, the finality in her eyes. He had watched her walk away without trembling. Now each night he poured whiskey he could not drink. He stared at their wedding photograph, her smile radiant, his hand proud on her waist. He whispered apologies into empty rooms, knowing they would never reach her. For the first time, he understood that some losses were final, and that realization broke him more than markets ever could. Months later, Alida and Ethan traveled to New York for a conference. The city no longer felt like a battlefield to her. It was simply geography, a backdrop to the life she had already claimed. At the gala, whispers spread quickly. Mateo Anderson is here. When their eyes met across the room, the world did not tilt. It did not burn. It simply acknowledged history. Mateo inclined his head slightly, his gaze heavy with regret. Alida returned the gesture, polite but distant. There was no anger in her, no longing, only recognition. History finally at rest. Ethan touched her hand lightly. "You're quiet." "I'm free," she replied. Ethan took her to a rooftop garden overlooking the Hudson on their last night in New York. The city stretched endlessly, lights flickering like constellations scattered below. He turned to her, his voice low, steady. "I've waited years. Not to rescue you, not to replace what you lost, only to walk beside you if you'll let me." Alida looked at him, her eyes shimmering with something she once thought she had lost forever: trust. She reached for his hand. "Walk beside me then. Not ahead, not behind. Beside." He smiled, and in that moment, the city blurred around them. There were no markets, boardrooms, or storms, only two hearts finally aligned. The next morning, as dawn broke over Manhattan, Alida stood by the hotel window. She thought of the girl she once was, the one who silently placed her ring on a dining table and carried a single suitcase into the night. She thought of the woman she had become, the one who stood in Tokyo, in Washington, in San Francisco, who claimed her voice and built her legacy. Every scar, every betrayal, every loss had not defined her. They had refined her. She was no longer a woman who lived in shadows. She was light itself. Back in Singapore, the Campbell Foundation flourished. Headlines celebrated her fund, and stories of women entrepreneurs thriving under her guidance spread across continents. Markets recognized her as not only a strategist, but a visionary. At conferences, her name no longer needed an introduction. In boardrooms, her presence no longer needed defense. And always at her side, Ethan, not as the man in front, not as the man behind, the man beside. Meanwhile, Mateo's name faded from the front pages. The world moved on. He finally learned the cruelest truth in solitude. Power could not buy back what was lost. Some investments never returned. Some losses were final. He sat in his father's old study, staring at the snow outside, whispering her name one last time into the silence. The silence answered him back. One evening in Singapore, Alida sat at her desk, pen in hand. She opened her leather-bound journal, the same one that had traveled with her through city storms and nights of study and tears. She wrote softly, her words almost like a letter to herself. "The day I signed my name on divorce papers, I thought I had lost everything. But I had only lost the version of me who forgot how to love herself. Today, I am not defined by what I lost, but by what I chose: dignity, courage, love. And that has made all the difference." She closed the book, her heart calm. Singapore's night shimmered outside her window. Ethan entered quietly, placing 2 glasses of wine on the table. She smiled, not the smile of survival, but of arrival. Together they stood at the glass, the city glowing beneath them. His hand brushed hers lightly, and she did not pull away. The world still churned with ambition, still roared with storms. But inside, there was peace. And in that peace, Alida Campbell knew the truth she had fought years to claim. She had never been ordinary. She had always been extraordinary. And now she was free.